My son looked at my old coat and told me I was ruining his Christmas aesthetic. He told me to go sleep in a motel because his wealthy friends were inside. He did not know I owned the roof over his head. I did not argue. I did not beg. I just drove away and canceled a single bank transfer. By morning, his perfect life was over. Before I tell you how I brought his world crashing down, please like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated you. The windshield wipers slapped a violent rhythm against the glass, trying to clear the heavy wet snow that was burying the interstate. It was a complete whiteout on I-90. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel of my '99 Ford F-150. Most men my age were sitting by a fire with a glass of eggnog right now. I was 71 years old and fighting a Chicago blizzard to see my son. Beside me on the passenger seat sat a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. I reached out and steadied it as the truck hit a patch of black ice. Inside that box was my grandfather's antique pocket watch. It had survived the Great Depression. It had survived 2 wars. I hoped it would survive the trip to Naperville. I just wanted to see my grandson, Timmy's eyes light up when he opened it. I pulled off the highway and navigated the winding streets of the subdivision. The houses here were massive. They were fortresses of brick and glass designed to show the world that the people inside had made it. I finally pulled into the driveway of number 42 Oak Lane. The house was blazing with light. It looked like a cruise ship docked in the snow. Expensive cars lined the heated paver driveway. There was a silver Mercedes, a brand new Porsche, a massive Range Rover. My rusted truck with its dented bumper looked like a stain on a silk sheet. I parked behind a black SUV and killed the engine. The silence was sudden and heavy. I took a deep breath. My bones ached from the cold. I grabbed the box and tucked it inside my heavy Carhartt coat to keep the cold metal from freezing. I opened the door and stepped out. The wind hit me like a physical blow. I did not care about the snow soaking my boots. I just wanted to see my family. I walked up the long path to the front door. I could hear the music from inside. It was smooth jazz mixed with the high-pitched laughter of people who have never had to worry about the heating bill. I rang the bell. I waited. I stomped the snow off my boots. The heavy oak door swung open. Brandon stood there. My son looked like he had stepped out of a fashion magazine. He was wearing a black tuxedo with a velvet collar. His hair was perfectly gelled. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch in one hand. He blinked at me as if he did not recognize the man who raised him. His smile vanished instantly. He did not step back to let me in. He stepped forward. He filled the doorframe with his body. "Dad, what are you doing here?" It was not a question. It was an accusation. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I forced a smile. "Merry Christmas, Brandon." I drove down to give Timmy his present. I thought I would surprise you all. Brandon looked over his shoulder nervously. He pushed the door until it was almost closed behind him, leaving only a sliver of warm light spilling onto the porch. He lowered his voice to a hiss. "We are hosting a party, Dad. Vanessa's boss is here. The investors for the new startup are here. Look at you." He gestured at me with his glass. He pointed at my coat, which was stained with grease from the truck door. He pointed at my flannel shirt. He looked at my wet boots. "You look like a mechanic. You look like a homeless person. You cannot come in looking like that. You are ruining the aesthetic. We are trying to close a deal tonight." My chest tightened. The cold wind bit at my face, but his words were colder. "I drove 4 hours in a blizzard, Brandon. I just want to see the boy. I want to give him his great-grandfather's watch." "No." Brandon cut me off. He took a sip of his scotch. "Not tonight. We are building an image here, Dad. We are high-net-worth individuals now. We cannot have you sitting on the white Italian sofas smelling like diesel and Old Spice. It is embarrassing. You need to leave. Leave. The word hung in the frozen air. Go to the Motel 6 off the highway. It is cheap. I will call you next week when things settle down. Maybe we can get lunch. But you have to go now. Then she appeared. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. She glided up behind Brandon like a shark in silk. She held a flute of champagne. Her dress was silver and backless and probably cost more than my truck. She did not look at my face. She looked at my boots on her welcome mat. Brandon, why is the door open? It is freezing in here. You are letting all the heat out. She saw me then. Her eyes narrowed. Oh. It is just Edward. Her lip curled in genuine disgust. She turned to Brandon. Honey, tell him to move his truck immediately. I can see it from the window. It is dripping oil on the new pavers. We just paid $10,000 for that driveway. It looks like a junkyard out there. She looked at me like I was the hired help coming to the wrong entrance. Please, Edward, we have important people here. Just go. I looked at my son. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to say that I was his father. I waited for him to remember the nights I sat up with him when he was sick, or the double shifts I worked to buy him his first car. Brandon just looked at his wife and then back at me. He shrugged. You heard her, Dad. You are dripping oil. Go to the motel. I will text you the address. He started to close the door. I looked at the warm light reflecting off his tuxedo. I looked at the diamond earrings swinging from Vanessa's ears. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the heartbreak that a father should feel. I felt a sudden absolute clarity. It was like the snow had stopped and the world was sharp and high definition. Okay, I said. My voice was steady. It did not shake. I adjusted the box under my arm. I felt the weight of the watch against my ribs. I would not let them have it. Not today. Not ever. Merry Christmas, Brandon. I turned my back on the warmth. I walked back into the wind. The snow hit my face like needles, but I did not flinch. I walked steadily back to my truck. I climbed into the cab and slammed the door. The engine roared to life with a rough cough. I looked at the house one last time. It was a beautiful house. It was a magnificent house. It should be. I paid for it. The number $4,800 flashed in my mind. That was the monthly mortgage transfer set to leave my account on the first of the month. It was an automatic payment I had set up 5 years ago. I shifted the truck into reverse. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. Merry Christmas, indeed. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I did not put the truck in gear for the motel. I turned the wheel toward the city. I had a long drive ahead of me. I had work to do, and I had a bank website to visit. Brandon thought he was a high net worth individual. He was about to find out exactly who the high net worth individual in this family really was. The Motel 6 was 5 miles down the interstate. It sat next to a truck stop with flickering neon lights that buzzed like dying insects. Brandon expected me to sleep there. He expected me to lie on a lumpy mattress, smelling of stale smoke and regret, while he toasted to his success with champagne I paid for. I drove right past the exit ramp without tapping the brakes. The old Ford rattled as I pushed it to 70 miles per hour. The heater blasted hot dust into my face, but it could not thaw the ice in my chest. I was not going to a motel. I was going to my office. The Chicago skyline rose out of the storm like a fortress of steel and light. I navigated the empty streets of the financial district. My truck looked ridiculous here, among the sleeping giants of commerce. I pulled up to the rear entrance of the Millennium Tower. It was the tallest residential building in the city. A steel gate blocked the ramp to the private garage. I rolled down the window and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The machine beeped once. The heavy steel gates slid open silently. I drove the rusted pickup into the pristine underground garage. It was filled with Ferraris and Bentleys covered in dust covers. I parked my truck in the spot marked PH1. It stood there dripping melted snow and oil onto the polished epoxy floor, right next to my own dusty Rolls-Royce Phantom that I had not driven in 6 months. I took the service elevator. It required a key card and a retinal scan. The doors closed, and my ears popped as the car shot upward. I watched the floor numbers blur. 10, 20, 40. The elevator slowed and opened directly into the penthouse foyer. The air here was different. It was filtered. It was expensive. It smelled of leather and cedar and absolute silence. I stepped out of the elevator and dropped my grease-stained Carhartt coat on the floor. I did not care. I owned the floor. I owned the elevator. I owned the building. I walked into the main living area. It was 5,000 square feet of glass and minimalist Italian furniture. The view from the 44th floor was breathtaking. The city lay spread out below me like a circuit board of amber and white lights. The snow was just white noise against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked past the grand piano that no one played anymore. I walked past the original Basquiat hanging on the wall. I headed straight for my office. This was the nerve center of my life. It was not a place for relaxation. It was a place for war. My desk was a slab of black obsidian. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair that cost more than my son's first car. I tapped the keyboard. The room was instantly bathed in the cool blue glow of 6 high-definition monitors. The Bloomberg terminals flickered to life. Rows of numbers and graphs scrolled by. Stocks, bonds, commodities, real estate futures. This was the language I spoke fluently. This was the world where I was a king, not an embarrassment. Brandon thought I fixed engines in a garage. He did not know I managed a private equity fund worth 9 figures. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a bottle of Macallan 50. I poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. I held it up to the light. This single glass was worth more than the entire case of wine Brandon had been bragging about. I took a sip. The burn was smooth and ancient. I set the glass down on the obsidian desk. I looked at the reflection of my face in the dark monitors. I looked old. I looked tired. But my eyes were sharp. They were the eyes of a predator who had just been woken up. I placed my hands on the keyboard. It was time to cancel Christmas. I placed the heavy crystal glass on a coaster made of petrified wood. The amber liquid trembled slightly, catching the blue light from the monitors. I cracked my knuckles. The sound was loud in the silent penthouse. I logged into the Sovereign Private Client portal. The interface was black and gold, designed for people whose net worth required 2 commas. A biometric scanner on the keyboard read my fingerprint. A second prompt asked for a code from a secure token. I entered it. The screen refreshed, revealing the financial circulatory system of my family. It was a complex web of transfers, standing orders, and supplementary accounts. I had built it to be a safety net. I realized now it had become a hammock. I navigated to the Recurring Transfers tab. There it was at the top of the list. Brandon, mortgage assistance, $4,800, scheduled for the 1st of every month. I stared at the numbers. They looked innocent enough, just digits on a screen. But those digits represented my sweat. They represented the winters I spent freezing on construction sites. They represented the summers I spent breathing concrete dust while Brandon was at tennis camp. I remembered the day we signed the papers for that house. Brandon had looked so proud. He told me he finally had a place worthy of his potential. I had been proud too. I thought I was giving him a foundation. I did not realize I was digging him a grave of dependency. I moved the cursor. It hovered over the cancel button. A dialog box popped up. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring payment? This action cannot be undone. I thought about the snow melting on my boots in his foyer. I thought about Vanessa's sneer. I thought about the warmth I was denied. I did not feel anger. Anger is hot and messy. This was cold. This was engineering. When a beam is rotten, you do not paint over it. You remove it before it brings down the whole roof. I clicked yes. The screen blinked. Status canceled. The first pillar of his life had just collapsed. He would not know it yet. He was probably laughing with his investors, raising a toast to his own brilliance. But the clock had started ticking. Next, I opened the credit cards tab. I scrolled down to the supplementary account ending in 8842. The Centurion Black Card. I had given it to Brandon 5 years ago. I told him it was for emergencies, for medical crises, for unexpected disasters. I clicked on Recent Transactions. The list populated the screen. It was a manifesto of excess. December 24th. The Liquor Barn. $3,200. December 23rd. Saks Fifth Avenue. $5,000. December 20th. The Ritz-Carlton Spa. $800. I scrolled back further. November. October. September. There were no emergencies here. There were no hospital bills. There were no car repairs. It was just a ceaseless parade of vanity. Designer clothes, 5-star dinners, weekends in Aspen. He was bleeding me dry one swipe at a time. He was using my labor to buy the costume of a successful man. He wanted the lifestyle of a CEO without the 60-hour work weeks. He wanted the respect without the sacrifice. I looked at the transaction from tonight. The $3,000 for the liquor. That was the champagne Vanessa was drinking. That was the scotch Brandon was holding when he closed the door in my face. I was paying for my own humiliation. I selected the card. I found the option for card management. There was a button that said Report Lost or Stolen. I ignored it. That would imply this was an accident. This was not an accident. This was a correction. I chose Deactivate User. Another box appeared. Reason for deactivation. I typed 2 words. Parental discretion. I hit enter. The status light next to the card number turned from green to red. Suspended. In a restaurant somewhere, or a club, or maybe right there in his living room, the next time Brandon tried to impress someone with that heavy piece of titanium, it would be nothing more than a paperweight. The waiter would come back. He would whisper. He would look at Brandon with pity. And the illusion would shatter. I took a sip of the Macallan. It tasted like justice. Finally, I navigated to the trusts section. The Timothy Caldwell Education Trust. This was the hardest part. This was for my grandson. I had set it up the day he was born. It was fully funded. Enough for private school from kindergarten through a PhD at Harvard. I had given Brandon trustee access so he could pay the tuition directly. He told me Timmy was at the Latin School of Chicago. He sent me report cards. He sent me newsletters. But as I looked at the withdrawal history, a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. The withdrawals did not match the tuition schedule. They were round numbers. 10,000 here, 15,000 there. Transfers to an LLC I did not recognize. Apex Ventures. I opened a new tab and searched the state business registry. Apex Ventures was registered to Brandon Caldwell. He was not paying tuition. He was funneling the money into his own pocket. My hand shook for the first time. This was not just greed. This was theft. He was stealing from his own son's future to fund his present. I thought about the boy. 10 years old. probably sitting in his room right now playing video games while his parents partied downstairs. I was not hurting Timmy by doing this. I was saving him. If I left this tap open, Brandon would drain it dry before the boy turned 18. I initiated a change of trustee protocol. As the grantor, I had the power to revoke access immediately. I removed Brandon's name. I removed Vanessa's name. I set the trust to locked. No withdrawals without my direct biometric authorization. I also flagged the previous transactions for audit. My legal team would see this in the morning. They would trace every cent. I sat back in the leather chair. The room was silent except for the hum of the hard drives. The screens showed the new reality. Mortgage canceled. Credit line terminated. Trust fund frozen. It was done. In 15 minutes, I had dismantled the entire financial infrastructure of my son's life. I did not feel like a father punishing a child. I felt like a surgeon who had just cut out a malignant tumor. It was a bloody business. It was painful. But it was necessary to save the patient. Brandon was the patient. He was sick with entitlement. He was infected with arrogance. I had just induced a coma. Now we would see if he had the strength to wake up. I closed the browser. The blue light faded, leaving me in the soft glow of the city lights. I swiveled my chair toward the window. The snow was still falling, blanketing Chicago in white. Somewhere out there in the suburbs, the party was still going. The music was still playing. But the power had just been cut. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, and I had just hit the iceberg. I finished the whiskey. I stood up and walked to the bedroom. I needed to sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a very busy day. I had 30 missed calls in my future, and I intended to enjoy every single one of them. The warmth inside number 42 Oak Lane was a sharp contrast to the frozen night outside. Brandon moved through the room with a practiced ease, his hand resting lightly on the shoulders of potential investors, his laugh perfectly calibrated to sound confident, but approachable. He was in his element. The house was his stage and he was the star. Vanessa was by the grand piano, charming her boss with stories of their family estate in the country. The air smelled of expensive perfume and success. A waiter approached Brandon with a silver tray. "Sir, the bill for the additional case of Dom Perignon you requested." Brandon smiled, waving a hand dismissively as he continued his conversation with a venture capitalist named Sterling. "Just put it on the card on file," Brandon said, not even looking at the waiter. "And make sure everyone's glass is full. We're celebrating tonight." "Of course, sir. But the terminal requires a quick authorization for this amount." Brandon sighed, a theatrical display of patience for the benefit of his guests. He pulled the heavy black titanium card from his tuxedo pocket. It felt substantial, a physical talisman of his father's invisible empire. He handed it to the waiter with a flourish. "Here, run it again." Sterling chuckled. "The burden of liquidity, eh, Brandon?" "You know how it is," Brandon replied, winking. "Fraud protection is so aggressive these days." The waiter inserted the card into the handheld terminal. The little machine whirred. A moment of silence stretched out. Then a sharp, flat beep cut through the ambient jazz. The waiter frowned. He pulled the card out and wiped the chip on his apron, then inserted it again. Another beep. A red light flashed on the device. "I'm sorry, sir," the waiter said, his voice dropping to a discreet whisper that somehow seemed louder than a shout. "It says do not honor. The card has been declined." Brandon's smile froze. A flicker of genuine panic sparked behind his eyes. "That's impossible," he hissed, snatching the card back. "That card has no limit. It's a centurion. Try it again." "I've tried it twice, sir. The system is locking me out. Do you have another form of payment?" Sterling was watching, now his eyebrows raised. The conversation nearby lulled. Vanessa looked over from the piano, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Is there a problem, darling?" she called out, her voice tight. "Just a glitch," Brandon said, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He fumbled for his wallet, pulling out his personal platinum card. He handed it over with shaking fingers. The waiter ran it. Another beep. Another red light. "Insufficient funds, sir." The silence in the room was now absolute. The music seemed to mock them. Brandon stood there holding two useless pieces of plastic, while the eyes of the people he most wanted to impress bore into him. The facade of the wealthy entrepreneur cracked, revealing the desperate, dependent boy underneath. Miles away in the silent penthouse, my phone vibrated on the obsidian desk. The screen lit up with a notification from the bank app. Transaction declined, $3,200. Merchant Elite Catering Services. Reason card suspended by primary account holder. I picked up the phone and looked at the message. I didn't smile. I didn't feel joy. I just felt the cold satisfaction of a mechanic hearing an engine finally stop making a terrible noise because he had cut the fuel line. I took another sip of the Macallan, the amber liquid warm in my throat, and watched the snow fall over the city. The first domino had fallen. The rest would follow soon enough. December 26th dawned cold and gray over Chicago. From the 44th floor, the city looked like a circuit board frozen in ice. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and permanent. Inside the penthouse, the air was still. I sat at the head of the long dining table. I was alone, but for the first time in years, I did not feel lonely. I felt focused. In front of me sat a steaming mug of Blue Mountain coffee. Black, no sugar, no cream, just the bitter, honest taste of the bean. It was the kind of simple pleasure I had been denied 2 nights ago standing on my son's doorstep. Next to the coffee mug lay my phone. It was face up on the polished mahogany surface. I had silenced the ringer hours ago. I had turned off the vibration. But the device was not dead. It was very much alive. Every few seconds, the screen would flare to life with a spectral white glow. A name would appear. Brandon. Then the screen would go dark for a moment before lighting up again. Vanessa. Then Brandon again. Then a number I did not recognize, which I assumed was a friend or maybe a lawyer they had frantically called. I watched the phone the way a scientist watches a specimen in a jar. I did not touch it. I did not flip it over to hide the notifications. I simply took a sip of my coffee and watched the desperate Morse code of their panic. The screen lit up again. Missed call Brandon 12. The number in the parenthesis was climbing. 13. 14. It was a rhythmic pulse of anxiety that I was observing from a godlike distance. For 5 years, my phone had only rung when they needed something. It rang when the roof needed fixing. It rang when the tuition was due. It rang when Vanessa wanted a vacation. It never rang just to say hello. It never rang to ask how my arthritis was doing or if I wanted to go fishing. I had trained them to treat me like an ATM, and like any machine they were now banging on the buttons because the cash had stopped coming out. I took another slow sip of coffee. The heat spread through my chest. I imagined the scene playing out in the suburbs. I imagined the hangover they must be nursing. The headache from the cheap champagne they surely had to switch to after my card was declined. I imagined the hushed, frantic whispers in their kitchen. They would be surrounded by the debris of their party. Stale food, empty bottles, and the crushing realization that the safety net they had bounced on for a decade had vanished overnight. The phone lit up again, missed call Vanessa 8. I wondered what stage of grief they were in. Denial was likely over. They were probably deep in anger now. Bargaining would come later. Depression would follow when the bills actually arrived. Acceptance was a long way off. I was not doing this to be cruel. I told myself that as I watched the screen flash again. I was doing this because a man who cannot survive the winter on his own is not a man. I had sheltered Brandon from the cold for too long. I had kept the greenhouse so warm that he had never grown deep roots. Now I had shattered the glass. The cold wind was blowing in. If he survived, he would be stronger. If he did not, well, that was a tragedy I had to be prepared to accept. The screen flashed. Missed call, Brandon, 25. The sheer volume of their desperation was validating. If they had called once or twice and then stopped, I might have worried. I might have thought there was a genuine emergency. But 30 calls in 48 hours was not an emergency. It was entitlement screaming in the face of reality. It was the tantrum of a child who has been told no for the first time in his life. I finished my coffee. I set the mug down with a soft click on the table. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the quiet apartment. I looked at the phone one last time. 30 missed calls, 30 opportunities to apologize that they had wasted, 30 demands for me to fix what they had broken. I reached out and picked up the device. It felt heavy in my hand. It was time to hear what they had to say. I was not going to call them back. Not yet. But I would listen. I would listen to every single word they had left in my voicemail. I wanted to hear the exact frequency of their fear. I swiped the screen and pressed play on the first message. The silence of the penthouse was broken by the sound of my son's voice, and it sounded exactly as pathetic as I expected. I pressed the speakerphone icon. The first message began to play. It was time-stamped at 12:30 in the morning, just 30 minutes after I had left their driveway. Brandon's voice filled the room. It was smooth and coated in that fake concern he used whenever he wanted a favor. Dad. Hey, it is Brandon. Listen. There was a weird hiccup with the card tonight. The waiter said it was declined. I am sure it is just a fraud alert because of the holiday spending. I know you probably went to bed, but give me a call as soon as you get this. We can call the bank together in the morning. Love you. I took a sip of my coffee. The lie was so casual. He did not believe it was a fraud alert. He knew exactly who controlled that account. But he was giving me an out. He was offering me a chance to pretend it was a mistake so we could both save face. He wanted me to apologize for the inconvenience and turn the tap back on. It was a test of my compliance. I skipped forward. Message 5. 2 in the morning. The smooth veneer was cracking. Dad, pick up the phone. This is not funny. Vanessa is freaking out. We had to put the rest of the bill on her personal card, and she is furious. Just call me back. I need you to authorize the transfer for the mortgage. It is due on the 1st. Do not make this difficult. I felt a cold amusement. Difficult. He thought this was difficult. He had no idea what difficult was. Difficult was digging a foundation in frozen ground because you needed to buy formula for your baby. Difficult was burying your wife and raising 2 sons alone while running a company. A declined credit card was not difficult. It was an inconvenience. I skipped to message 12, 7 in the morning. The tone had shifted from annoyance to genuine anger. Are you ignoring me? I drove by the Motel 6. Your truck is not there. Where the hell are you? You cannot just disappear. We have responsibilities, Dad. We have bills. You promised to help us. You gave me your word. I paused the playback. I promised to help him. That was true. But help is not a lifetime sentence of servitude. Help is a hand up, not a handout. He had twisted my promise into a contract of slavery. He believed he was entitled to my labor simply because he shared my DNA. I pressed play on message 20. This one was different. It was not directed at me. It was a pocket dial. Brandon must have called and forgotten to hang up, or maybe the phone was lying on a table while they argued. The audio was muffled, but the voices were distinct. I leaned in. This was the raw, unvarnished truth. You said he was handled, Brandon. That was Vanessa. Her voice was a shriek. It lacked the sultry sophistication she displayed at parties. It was the voice of a spoiled child who had been denied a toy. You said the old man was a golden goose. You said he would never cut us off because he wants to see Timmy. Well, guess what? The card is dead. The transfer is canceled. I checked the app. It says account closed. I heard the sound of glass shattering. Something had been thrown. I have a stylist coming at noon, Brandon. I have a deposit due for the Aspen trip. How am I supposed to pay for that? Do you expect me to cancel? Do you expect me to tell my friends we are broke because your father is having a tantrum? Fix this. Fix it now, or I swear I am taking Timmy and going to my mother's. I closed my eyes. There it was. The truth I had suspected, but never wanted to confirm. They were not worried about the mortgage. They were not worried about putting food on the table. They were worried about stylists and ski trips. They were fighting over luxuries, while I sat alone in a penthouse they did not know existed. Vanessa did not love my son. She loved the lifestyle I provided for him. And Brandon did not love me. He viewed me as a utility. I was no different to them than the electricity or the internet. I was just a service they expected to work without interruption. I skipped to the final message. Message 30. It had arrived 10 minutes ago. The voice was cold. It was precise. It was the voice of a man who had decided to go to war. Okay, Dad. You want to play games? We can play games. I called the police. I told them you are missing. I told them you have been acting erratic lately. Confused. Aggressive. I told them I am worried you might be a danger to yourself. When they find you, I am going to petition for emergency guardianship. We are going to get power of attorney, Dad. We are going to take control of the accounts for your own good. You are obviously not well. Just wait. The cops are looking for your truck right now. The message ended with a sharp click. I stared at the phone. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. He had done it. He had crossed the line from ungrateful son to enemy combatant. He was threatening to take away my freedom. He was threatening to lock me away and strip me of my dignity so he could keep buying champagne and designer suits. He was using the very laws meant to protect the vulnerable as a weapon to exploit me. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was the calm of a soldier who finally sees the enemy clearly. There was no more ambiguity. There was no more hope for reconciliation. He had fired the first shot. I picked up the phone. I did not call Brandon. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It was a number I rarely used on holidays, but this was an exception. Patterson. The voice on the other end was gruff and alert. My lawyer did not sleep. Edward. It is the day after Christmas. Is everything all right? No, Patterson, everything is not all right. But it is about to be. I need you to prepare a file. I want to execute the true owner clause on the Naperville property. There was a pause on the line. Patterson knew what that meant. He had drawn up the papers himself 5 years ago. You are evicting him, Edward. I looked out the window at the frozen city. I thought about the threat in my voicemail. I thought about Vanessa screaming about her stylist. I thought about my grandson living in a house built on lies. I am not evicting him, Patterson. I am terminating his lease. He violated the terms. He failed to pay the rent of being a decent human being. I want them out. Prepare the papers. And call the sheriff. I want a civil standby when we serve them. You want the sheriff involved. That is heavy-handed, Edward. They threaten to have me committed, Patterson. They threaten to take my autonomy. I am done being gentle. I want them on the street. I want the locks changed. I want the illusion destroyed. Understood. I will have the paperwork ready in an hour. I hung up the phone. The coffee in my mug was cold. I poured it into the sink. I did not need caffeine anymore. I was fueled by something much more potent. I was fueled by the absolute certainty of my actions. My son wanted a war. He was about to find out that he was fighting a man who had been conquering hostile territory since before he was born. I walked to the closet and pulled out a fresh suit. It was time to dress for battle. I set the phone down on the cold marble of the kitchen island. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wind against the glass. 30 missed calls, threats of police, threats of guardianship. My own son was plotting to put me in a cage so he could keep living in a palace I paid for. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, surgical precision. It was time to remove the cancer. I picked up the phone again and dialed a number that was programmed into my speed dial under "in case of emergency." It rang once. "Edward." The voice was gravelly sharp and instantly alert. Arthur Patterson did not do pleasantries. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to bury someone, not when you wanted to negotiate. "I need you to open the file on the Oak Lane property," I said. My voice was calm, steady, devoid of the tremor Brandon claimed to hear in his messages. "The holding company, Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, LLC. There was a rustle of papers on the other end, or maybe just the sound of Patterson shifting in his leather chair. He knew exactly which file I meant. "I have it," Patterson said. "What do you need? A tax assessment? A deed transfer?" "No," I said. "I need an eviction notice. Immediate." The line went silent for a beat. Patterson was a shark, but even sharks pause when they smell their own blood in the water. "Edward," he said slowly, "you are talking about your son. You are talking about the house he has lived in for 5 years, the house his neighbors think he owns." "He does not own it," I corrected him. "And you know that better than anyone because you drafted the contract." I walked over to the window, looking down at the frozen grid of Chicago. 5 years ago, when Brandon bought that house, he didn't have the credit score to finance a toaster, let alone a $2 million estate. So I bought it. I bought it through a shell company to protect his ego. And then I had him sign a lease, a very specific, very unusual lease. The $1 lease, Patterson muttered, the memory clearly surfacing. Rent of $1 per annum, renewable monthly at the sole discretion of the landlord. "Exactly," I said, "and the landlord is no longer feeling discretionary." "Edward, that lease was a formality. It was designed to protect the asset in case of a divorce, not to kick your son out on the street in the middle of winter. The terms were clear, Arthur. The lease is at will. It can be terminated by the owner with 3 days' notice for any reason or immediately for conduct detrimental to the property or the owner. He threatened to have me committed, Arthur. He threatened to use the legal system to strip me of my rights. I would call that detrimental conduct." "He did what?" Patterson's tone hardened instantly. The lawyer in him woke up. "He threatened guardianship. He left a voicemail. He is going to claim I am senile. He wants power of attorney." "That little—" Patterson trailed off. I could hear the click of a keyboard now. Fast. Aggressive. "Okay. The game has changed. If he files for guardianship, he freezes your assets during the investigation. He could lock you out of your own accounts while the court decides if you know what day it is. Which is why I need to strike first," I said. "I want the lease terminated. I want a notice to quit served tomorrow morning. I want the locks changed. I want the security codes wiped. If we execute the termination clause based on the detrimental conduct provision, we don't have to give him 30 days. Patterson mused, his mind moving like a chess player. "We can give him 72 hours. But Edward, this is the nuclear option. Once we serve him, there is no going back. He will fight. He will scream. He will drag your name through the mud." "He is already dragging my name through the muds," I said. "He is telling the police I am a danger to myself. I am simply proving that the only danger I pose is to his delusions of grandeur. Do you want to negotiate? Patterson asked. We could offer him a bridge, 6 months to move out, a small stipend to get an apartment. I thought about the snow on my boots. I thought about Vanessa looking at me like I was trash. I thought about my grandson Timmy living in a house of cards that was about to collapse on his head. If I gave them an inch, they would take a mile. If I gave them time, they would find a way to hurt me. No negotiation, I said. The words tasted like iron. I want them out. I want them on the street. I want them to understand that the roof over their heads was a privilege, not a right, and that privilege has been revoked. Understood, Patterson said. I will draft the papers. I will have a process server ready at dawn. And Edward, yes, if he really files for guardianship, we will need to be ready. I'm going to prepare a competency affidavit. You might need to see a doctor of our choosing just to have it on record. Way ahead of you, I said. Just get the house back, Arthur. It's time to clean house. I hung up the phone. The sun was fully up now, reflecting off the glass towers of the city. The light was harsh and unforgiving. It revealed every crack in the pavement, every flaw in the concrete. That was good. I was done with shadows. I was done with hiding the truth to protect a lie. I was going to shine a light on my son's life, and whatever burned away in the glare was never real to begin with. The intercom on my desk buzzed at exactly 9 o'clock. The concierge downstairs announced a guest. Mr. Griffin. I pressed the button to unlock the elevator. I did not stand up. I did not pace. I sat behind my obsidian desk and watched the steel doors slide open. Detective Griffin stepped into the penthouse. He did not look like a private eye from a cheap novel. He looked like an investment banker who had seen too many crime scenes. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly and carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy. He walked across the room with the silent efficiency of a man who charges $500 an hour to find the skeletons in people's closets. He did not look at the view. He did not look at the art. He looked at me. Good morning, Mr. Caldwell. He said it without smiling. He sat in the chair opposite me and placed the briefcase on his lap. The click of the latches sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. I trust you found what I was looking for, I said. My voice was flat. I wanted this to be a business transaction. I wanted to pretend I was auditing a failing subsidiary, not dissecting my own family. Griffin pulled out a folder. It was thick, manila, at least 2 inches of paper. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward me. The sound of the paper sliding across the stone was a dry whisper. I found everything, Edward, and then I found more. You asked me to follow the money. I did. But money leaves a trail of slime if you know where to look. I looked at the folder. It sat there between us like a physical object of mass. It contained 5 years of my son's life. It contained the answers to every question I had been too afraid to ask. Why did they always need more cash? Why did my grandson never talk about school? Why did Vanessa always look at me with that mixture of boredom and contempt? It is bad, isn't it? I asked. Griffin nodded once. It is worse than bad. It is criminal. If you take this to the police, you will not just be evicting them. You will be sending them away for a long time. I felt a coldness spread through my chest. Prison. My son in prison. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange detachment. A builder knows that if the foundation is rotten, the house will fall. It does not matter how much you love the house. Gravity does not care about sentiment. I reached out and placed my hand on the file. The paper felt cool. I paid for their life, Griffin. I paid for the cars, the clothes, the food. I paid for the air they breathed. I have a right to know what I bought. You bought lies, Edward. Expensive lies. Griffin leaned back. Take a look. But I warn you, once you open that, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to being the grandfather who just signs checks. You become the witness. I did not hesitate. I had spent 48 hours being threatened and insulted by the people I protected. I was done with blindfolds. I flipped the cover open. The first page was a summary, a flowchart of funds. My eyes scanned the numbers, the dates, the recipients. My breath hitched. It was not just waste. It was not just mismanagement. It was a systematic looting of my goodwill. I turned the page to the first set of photographs, and then my heart stopped beating and turned into a stone. The first photograph was not grainy or blurred like something from a cheap detective movie. It was crystal clear. It showed my daughter-in-law Vanessa standing outside the entrance of the Peninsula Hotel. She was wearing a coat I had bought her for her birthday. She was not alone. A man was with her. He was young. He was fit. He looked like the kind of man whose biggest worry was his protein intake. His hand was resting on the small of her back in a way that was intimate and possessive. They were laughing. It was the kind of carefree, genuine laughter I had never seen her share with my son. I flipped the photo. On the back, Griffin had written a date and a time, Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 1 and 4 in the afternoon. I looked at the next photo. They were in the lobby. The man was whispering in her ear. The third photo showed them entering an elevator. Griffin pointed a pen at a spreadsheet next to the photos. Look at the cross-reference, Edward. Look at the expenses on the supplementary card ending in 8842. I looked. I saw the charges I had glossed over for months, assuming they were just the cost of maintaining a high-maintenance woman. Elite Fitness Consulting, $2,000 a month. Wellness retreats, $500 a session. I had assumed she was getting in shape. I had assumed she was taking tennis lessons. I was wrong. I was paying a salary. I traced the line item with my finger. The date matched the photo. The time matched the charge. I looked at the merchant code for wellness retreats. It was not a spa. It was the hotel bar and room service. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the whiskey. I had not just supported my son's family. I had subsidized his wife's infidelity. I had paid for the champagne she drank with her lover. I had paid for the room where she betrayed my son. Every time I signed a check or authorized a transfer, I was making a fool of myself and a cuckold of Brandon. She calls him her personal trainer, Griffin said quietly. He is 24 years old. He is an aspiring model. She bought him a watch last month using your card, a Rolex Submariner. I remembered the charge. It was listed as jewelry, gift. I thought it was for Brandon. I thought she was being a good wife. I looked at the photo of the boy's wrist. There it was, my money glinting in the sun. I pushed the photos of Vanessa away. They were filthy, but they were simple. Lust is a simple sin. It is ugly, but it is human. What came next was worse. Griffin opened the second section of the file. This was Brandon's life. You told me he was investing in tech startups, Griffin said. You told me he needed liquidity for angel investing rounds. I nodded. Brandon had given me polished pitch decks. He had shown me graphs of projected growth. He had used words like disruption and synergy. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the boy who used to build Lego towers with me had grown into a builder of businesses. Griffin laid out a series of bank statements. These were not from Silicon Valley. They were from offshore accounts in Malta and Curaçao. Apex Ventures is not a venture capital firm, Edward. It is a shell entity used to funnel money into online gambling sites, high-stakes poker, sports betting, and worst of all, crypto futures leverage trading. I stared at the columns of red ink. The numbers were staggering. $10,000 lost on a Tuesday. $50,000 evaporated on a Sunday night. He is an addict, Griffin said. He chases the loss. He loses 10, so he bets 20 to make it back. He loses 20, so he bets 40. I saw a transfer for $200,000 dated 6 months ago. That was the money I gave him for the seed round of a logistics company. He had stood in my office and looked me in the eye and shook my hand. He had sold me a dream. And then he had gone home, sat in front of a computer, and clicked a mouse until the money was gone. I looked at the dates. The losses accelerated in December. That explained the party. That explained the desperation. He was not celebrating success. He was trying to project an image of wealth to attract new investors he could defraud. He was running a Ponzi scheme, and I was the primary investor. I looked at the mortgage payments I had been making. $4,800 a month. If I hadn't paid that, the house would have been foreclosed on years ago. He wasn't spending his own money on the house because he didn't have any money. He had gambled it all away. The debt collectors are calling him, Griffin said. I found emails, threats. He owes a bookie in Cicero $50,000. He owes the banks another $100. He is drowning Edward. And he was using you as his life raft. I closed the file. I did not want to see any more. I felt dirty. I felt complicit. I had created this monster. I had fed it with cash and sheltered it from consequences. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was helping him build a life. Instead, I had financed a casino and a brothel. My son was a liar and a thief. His wife was an adulterer who used my money to keep a boy toy. And they had the audacity to tell me I wasn't good enough to walk through their front door. They had judged my boots while they stood in a house built on fraud. I looked up at Griffin. My face felt like it was carved from stone. Is that all? Griffin hesitated. He looked down at the file. He had not closed it yet. His hand rested on the final tab. The tab was labeled Timothy. No, Edward. That is not all. The worst part is what they did to the boy. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest. Not Timmy. Anyone but Timmy. Show me, I commanded. And Griffin turned the page. Griffin flipped the tab marked Timothy. The paper made a dry, rasping sound that seemed to echo in the silent penthouse. I expected to see trust fund statements. I expected to see more financial bleeding. I was prepared to see that Brandon had raided his son's future to pay for his own present. I was not prepared for what I saw. The first document was not a bank statement. It was a report card. I stared at the header. It did not say the Latin School of Chicago. It did not have the crest of the prestigious private institution I had been writing checks to for 5 years. It said Lincoln Elementary, District Public School. I felt the room tilt slightly. I reached out and gripped the edge of the obsidian desk. The Latin school cost $35,000 a year. I sent the check directly to Brandon every August. I sent additional checks for uniforms, for books, for the rowing club, for the debate team. Brandon had sent me newsletters. He had told me stories about Timmy's Latin teacher. He had told me about the field trip to the Art Institute. It was all a lie. A fabrication so complete and so cruel that it took my breath away. Griffin spoke. His voice was lower now. He sounded like a man apologizing for a death. He never enrolled him, Edward. He took the tuition checks and deposited them into the Apex Ventures account. Then he wired the money to a casino in Antigua. Timmy goes to the local public school. It is underfunded. It is overcrowded. And according to these attendance records, he misses about 2 days a week because no one wakes up to take him. I looked at the grades. D in math, D in English, incomplete in science. My grandson was a brilliant boy. I knew this. I had seen him take apart a watch when he was 6. I had seen the curiosity in his eyes. and they had thrown him into a warehouse for children and let him rot while they drank champagne on my dime. They had stolen his education. They had stolen his potential. They had looked at his future and decided it was worth less than a few hands of blackjack. I felt a heat rising in my neck. It was not the cold anger I had felt toward Brandon's spending. This was different. This was primal. This was the fury of a patriarch who realizes the wolf is not at the door, but sleeping in the master bedroom. Griffin slid a second stack of papers across the desk. It gets worse, Edward. I did not think it could get worse. I was wrong. These are background checks, Griffin said. These are the women Vanessa hired to watch the boy while she was at her wellness retreats, and Brandon was playing businessman. I looked at the photos. Mugshots. 3 of them. They found them on message boards, Griffin explained. Unlicensed, unvetted, the cheapest labor they could find. This one here. She has a DUI and a charge for child endangerment. She was watching Timmy for 3 months last year. This one was fired from a daycare for hitting a child. She was with him all summer. I looked at the faces of these strangers, these people who had been given access to my blood. Vanessa spent $2,000 a month on a personal trainer to stroke her ego, but she would not spend $20 an hour to ensure her son was safe. She hired criminals because they were cheap. She hired them because she did not care. I closed my eyes. I imagined Timmy, 10 years old, sitting in that big empty house with a stranger who smelled like alcohol, waiting for parents who were too busy pretending to be rich to come home. Griffin pushed a USB drive across the desk. I interviewed the last nanny. She quit 2 weeks ago. She was the only decent one they hired. She quit because she couldn't take it anymore. She gave me this. It is footage from the nanny cam she set up in the kitchen because she was worried about the boy. I plugged the drive into my computer. A video window popped up. It was grainy footage of the kitchen at 42 Oak Lane. The kitchen I had paid for. The kitchen with the Viking range and the Sub-Zero fridge. It was night. The timestamp said, 3 p.m. Timmy walked into the frame. He was wearing pajamas that looked too small for him. He opened the massive refrigerator. The light from the fridge illuminated his face. He looked pale. He looked small. The fridge was full. It was stocked with vodka. It was stocked with mixers. There were bottles of expensive water. There were trays of catering leftovers from some party. But there was no real food. There was no milk. There was no fruit. Timmy moved a bottle of Grey Goose aside. He reached for a container of yogurt. He opened it, smelled it, and put it back. He closed the fridge. He went to the pantry. He came out with a box of dry cereal. He sat at the island, alone, in the dark, and he ate the cereal dry from the box with his hands. I watched my grandson eat dinner like a scavenging animal in a house worth $2 million. Then the audio kicked in. The front door opened. Laughter. Brandon and Vanessa stumbled into the frame. They were dressed for a gala. They were loud. They were drunk. Vanessa saw Timmy sitting there. She did not hug him. She did not ask him if he had eaten. She sighed, a loud, exaggerated sigh of annoyance. Timmy. Go to bed, she slurred. You are messing up the kitchen. We have people coming over for drinks. Timmy didn't say a word. He just closed the cereal box. He slid off the stool. He walked past his mother. She didn't look at him. She was looking at her reflection in the oven door, checking her makeup. Brandon was already pouring drinks. He didn't even acknowledge the boy's existence. I watched Timmy walk up the stairs. His shoulders were slumped. He looked like an old man carrying the weight of the world. I paused the video. I could not watch anymore. The glass of Macallan sat on my desk. I picked it up. My hand was shaking. Not from fear, from rage. a pure white-hot rage that burned away every other emotion I had ever felt. I squeezed the glass. I squeezed it until I felt the crystal groan, and then I threw it. I threw it at the wall. It shattered with a violence that felt necessary. The whiskey stained the expensive silk wallpaper. I did not care. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out at the city, but I did not see the lights. I saw Timmy eating dry cereal in the dark. For 48 hours, I had been operating like a businessman. I had been cutting costs. I had been terminating contracts. I had been teaching a lesson about financial responsibility. I thought I was dealing with a spoiled brat. I thought I was dealing with entitlement. I was wrong. I was dealing with monsters. Brandon was not just a bad son. He was a bad father. He was a predator who preyed on his own child. He had sacrificed Timmy's education, Timmy's safety, and Timmy's happiness on the altar of his own vanity. The money did not matter anymore. The house did not matter. The disrespect at the Christmas party did not matter. Those were insults. This was war. I turned back to Griffin. He was watching me. He did not look surprised by my outburst. He looked like a man who had been waiting for me to catch up. "You have enough for custody," Griffin said quietly. "The neglect, the fraud, the unsafe environment. If you file for emergency custody, you will win." "Custody is not enough," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It was low. It was guttural. It sounded like a growl. "I do not just want the boy Griffin. I want to destroy them." I walked back to the desk. I looked at the file. I looked at the lies. I want Brandon to feel what Timmy felt. I want him to be cold. I want him to be hungry. I want him to sit in the dark and wonder if anyone is coming to save him. I looked at Griffin. "I want you to call the district attorney." Griffin raised an eyebrow. "For the fraud, Edward. For the gambling." "No," I said. "For the child endangerment. For the misappropriation of a trust fund. For the theft. I want charges pressed. I want him in handcuffs. I want him to rot in a cell where the only thing he has to wear is a jumpsuit that doesn't fit, and the only thing he has to eat is what they slide under the door." But before that, I continued my mind racing, calculating, plotting. Before the police take him, I want him to lose everything. I want him to stand in the rubble of his life and know that I was the one who lit the fuse. I picked up the phone. I dialed Patterson again. Edward Patterson answered immediately. "Change of plans, Arthur. The eviction notice. Is it ready? It is on my desk." "Good. But I need you to add something. I need you to prepare a petition for emergency custody of Timothy Caldwell." There was a silence on the line. Then Patterson spoke, his voice serious. "Custody, Edward. That is a different beast. You need grounds. You need proof of immediate harm." I looked at the photo of the mugshot nanny. I looked at the report card. I looked at the frozen image of my grandson eating dry cereal. "I have proof, Arthur. I have proof that will make a judge vomit. Just draft the papers." "And Patterson?" "Yes. I want you to be at the house on New Year's Eve. I want the sheriff there. I want Griffin there. I am coming to the party. You are going to serve them at the party." "Yes. Edward, that will be a scene. It will be a massacre." "I know," I said. I looked at the stain on the wall where the whiskey had hit. "Brandon likes parties, Arthur. He likes an audience. He likes to show off. So I am going to give him the show of a lifetime. I am going to show everyone exactly who he is. And then I am going to take my grandson and I am going to burn that house to the ground." I hung up the phone. I sat down. I was trembling, but I was not weak. I was energized. I had a mission. I had a purpose. I was not just a retired builder anymore. I was a grandfather. And God help anyone who stood between me and that boy. I looked at the folder one last time. I closed it. The evidence was sealed. The verdict was in. The sentence would be carried out on New Year's Eve, and it would be a capital punishment. The chandeliers at 42 Oak Lane were blazing, with enough wattage to light up a runway. From the street, the house looked like a beacon of prosperity in the cold Illinois night. Inside, the air smelled of expensive lilies and impending disaster. It was New Year's Eve, the biggest night of the year, and Brandon Caldwell was sweating through his second silk shirt of the evening. He stood near the ice sculpture, which was slowly dripping onto the tablecloth. He held a glass of champagne that he had paid for by pawning his Rolexes an hour before the guests arrived. He swirled the liquid and forced a smile that felt like it was stapled to his face. He was cornering a man named Mr. Henderson, a retired orthodontist with too much money and not enough sense. "You have to understand, Gary," Brandon said, leaning in close. "The returns on the first round were astronomical. We are opening the Series B round tonight, exclusively for friends and family. My father, Edward Caldwell, you know the name, right? The construction magnate, he is acting as the primary guarantor. He just prefers to stay in the background these days. Silent partner, you know how the old school guys are." Brandon took a sip of the wine. His hand trembled slightly. He hid it by adjusting his cufflinks. He was lying. He was lying with every breath. There was no Series B. There was no guarantor. There was only a $50,000 debt to a bookie in Cicero who had promised to break his legs if he did not pay by January 2nd. Henderson nodded, looking impressed. "Your father built half the skyline, Brandon. If he is backing this, it must be solid." "What is the buy-in?" $50,000, Brandon said quickly. Too quickly. He cleared his throat. "Minimum unit is 50, but for tonight only, I can get you in for 40 if you can wire the funds before the ball drops. We need to close the books for the tax year." Across the room, Vanessa was performing her own high-wire act. She was wearing a red dress that she had bought worn and planned to return the next morning, with the tags still tucked inside. She was laughing at a joke made by a woman whose husband owned a chain of car dealerships. The laugh was shrill. It was brittle. It sounded like glass breaking. Vanessa's eyes darted around the room constantly. She wasn't looking at the guests. She was looking at the staff. She was terrified that the catering manager would walk up and demand the final payment she didn't have. She was terrified the power company would cut the lights. Every time a phone rang, she flinched. She caught Brandon's eye across the crowded room. She raised her eyebrows in a silent, desperate question. "Did you get the money?" Brandon gave a microscopic nod. He was close. Henderson was reaching for his checkbook. This was their life now. A frantic hustle to cover yesterday's lies with today's fraud. They were building a castle on quicksand, and the tide was coming in fast. They thought they could fix it. They thought if they just got one more check, one more investor, one more lifeline, they could pay off the debts and restart the cycle. They were addicts addicted to an image they could no longer afford. "I will write it now," Henderson said, pulling a gold pen from his pocket. "Who do I make it out to?" "Apex Ventures," Brandon said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Just make it out to Apex." He watched the pen touch the paper. He felt a rush of adrenaline. He was going to make it. He was going to survive another month. He would pay the bookie. He would pay the mortgage arrears. He would figure out the rest later. He just needed to survive tonight. The room was loud. The jazz band was playing a frenetic version of Auld Lang Syne. People were laughing, drinking, eating canapés that cost $3 a bite. They had no idea they were standing in a crime scene. They had no idea their host was a criminal. They saw the suit. They saw the house. They saw the smile. They did not see the rot underneath. Brandon took the check. His fingers brushed against the paper. It felt like salvation. Thank you, Gary, he said, his voice thick with relief. You won't regret this. He folded the check and slid it into his breast pocket right next to his heart. He took a deep breath. He had done it. He had pulled another rabbit out of the hat. Then the music stopped. It didn't fade out. It stopped dead. The drummer caught his stick mid-air. The saxophone player lowered his instrument. A hush rippled through the room, starting at the foyer and spreading outward like a shockwave. The laughter died. The clinking of glasses ceased. Brandon frowned. He turned toward the entrance, annoyed. "What is going on?" he muttered. "Who stopped the band?" He pushed through the crowd. Vanessa was already moving toward the door, her face pale. Brandon stopped. The crowd parted. Standing in the archway of the grand ballroom was not a guest. It was not a caterer. It was me. I stood there in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Brandon's entire wardrobe. I was not alone. On my right stood Arthur Patterson holding a thick leather binder. On my left stood the county sheriff, his badge gleaming under the chandelier. And behind me stood 2 uniformed officers and Detective Griffin. I did not look like a mechanic tonight. I did not look like a confused old man. I looked like the person who owned the building. Brandon's mouth opened. He touched the check in his pocket as if to reassure himself it was real. "Dad," he squeaked. I stepped into the room. The sound of my shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the house. "Happy New Year, Brandon," I said, my voice carried to the back of the room without shouting. "I hope you enjoyed the party, because it is over." I walked into the light of the ballroom. My Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor with a sound that was sharp and authoritative. It was the only sound in the room. The crowd parted for me. They did not move aside out of politeness. They moved because of an instinctual recognition of power. I did not look like the old man who had been turned away from the doorstep in a blizzard. I stood tall. My spine was straight. The charcoal suit fit me like armor. Sheriff Miller stepped up beside me. He was a large man. He filled the space with the heavy presence of the law. He did not smile. He did not wave. He stood with his hands resting on his belt near his badge. His presence turned the party into a crime scene instantly. On my other side, Arthur Patterson opened his thick leather binder. The snap of the metal rings echoed like a gunshot. He pulled out a stack of documents stamped with the seal of the court. I saw the confusion ripple through the guests. These were people who judged value by appearance. They looked at my watch. It was a Patek Philippe. They looked at my shoes. They looked at the way I held myself. They realized with a sudden jolt that they had misjudged the hierarchy of this house. They looked from me to Brandon, and they saw the difference between a lion and a house cat. Brandon was frozen. The glass of champagne in his hand was tilting dangerously. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the lawyer. He looked at me. His brain was trying to process the impossible. He was trying to understand how his father, the mechanic, had just walked in with the county authorities and a suit worth more than his car. Dad Brandon stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager. "What is this? Why is the sheriff here? You cannot just barge in here. We are entertaining." I did not answer him immediately. I let his question hang in the air. I let him sweat. I looked around the room. I made eye contact with Mr. Henderson, the investor. I saw the moment of recognition in his eyes. He knew my face, Huon. He had seen it in the business journals from a decade ago. He looked at the check he had just written. He looked at Brandon. And then he slowly took a step back. He put distance between himself and my son. He knew. I turned my gaze back to Brandon. I looked at him with the cold detachment of a judge passing a sentence. "I am not barging in." "Brandon," I said, my voice calm and level, "I am entering my property. and I brought some friends to help me clean up the mess." Vanessa pushed through the crowd. Her face was a mask of fury and fear. She saw the sheriff and faltered for a second, but her arrogance pushed her forward. She did not see the danger. She only saw her party being ruined. She saw her social standing evaporating. "Get out!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Get out of my house! You are drunk! You are senile! Someone call the police!" Sheriff Miller stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am the police, ma'am," he said, "and nobody is calling anyone. We are here to execute a court order." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the party. The guests began to shift. They set down their drinks. They looked for the exits. The illusion of the perfect wealthy couple was shattering in real time. The golden light of the chandeliers seemed to turn harsh and interrogating. I looked at Vanessa. I looked at the red dress she planned to return. I looked at the fear behind her eyes. She knew. Deep down, she knew that the ride was over. "This is not your house, Vanessa," I said. "It never was. You were guests. You were tenants who paid $1 a year, and you just violated the lease." Patterson stepped forward and held up the documents. "This is a notice to quit," Patterson announced to the room. "Effective immediately. And this is a writ of possession granted by the emergency court this afternoon. Mr. Edward Caldwell is the sole legal owner of this estate, and he is reclaiming it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Brandon dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, spraying champagne over his shoes. He did not even notice. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He realized that the man standing in front of him was not the father he had exploited. I was the landlord, and rent was due. Vanessa lunged forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury that threatened to crack her heavy makeup. She planted herself between me and her guests, spreading her arms wide as if she could physically block the truth from reaching them. Her voice rose to a shriek that bounced off the high ceilings and made the crystal chandelier tremble. "You have no right to be here," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "This is my home. My name is on the mailbox. My things are in the closet. You are trespassing, Edward. You are a senile old man who is confused and jealous of his son's success. Officer, remove him. Remove him right now, or I will sue this entire county for harassment." She turned to the crowd, seeking allies, seeking anyone who would validate her delusion. "Can you believe this?" she pleaded with the room at large. "He is trying to ruin our reputation because he is lonely. He is sick. He needs a doctor, not a lawyer." The guests did not step forward. They stepped back. They watched with the morbid curiosity of people witnessing a public execution. Vanessa was not rallying them. She was terrifying them. She looked unhinged. She looked guilty. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I looked past her to my son. Brandon was still frozen, his hand clutching the empty air where his champagne glass had been. He was pale. He was sweating. He knew the truth, but he was praying that if he stayed silent, maybe the nightmare would end. "Tell her, Brandon," I said calmly. "Tell your wife who signed the checks for the down payment. Tell her whose name is on the title deed stored in the county records." Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dock. Vanessa spun around to face him. Her eyes were wild. "Tell him, Brandon. Tell him to get out. Show him the papers. Show him we own this place." Brandon looked at the floor. He could not meet her eyes. He could not meet mine. "He cannot show you those papers, Vanessa," I said, stepping closer, "because they do not exist." Arthur Patterson stepped into the center of the room. He cleared his throat. The sound was dry and commanded instant attention. He opened the leather binder he had been holding. He did not look at Vanessa. He looked at the investors scattered around the room. He looked at Mr. Henderson, who was still clutching the check in his pocket. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson began, his voice projecting with the practiced cadence of a courtroom veteran. "There seems to be a significant misunderstanding regarding the ownership of this estate. Let us clarify the record." He pulled a document from the binder. It was blue-backed and stamped with the official seal of the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. "This is the deed to the property located at 42 Oak Lane," Patterson said, holding it up. "It lists the sole owner as Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, LLC. He turned the page. "And this is the operating agreement for Caldwell Real Estate Holdings, LLC. It lists the sole member and managing partner as Mr. Edward Caldwell." Vanessa laughed. It was a brittle, hysterical sound. "So what?" she spat. "That is just a technicality for taxes. Brandon explained it to me. It is a family trust. It belongs to us." Patterson shook his head slowly. He pulled another document from the stack. This one was thinner. It looked simple. It was the document that was about to hang my son. "This is not a trust document," Patterson corrected her. "This is a residential lease agreement, dated 5 years ago, signed by Brandon Caldwell as tenant and Edward Caldwell as landlord." He walked over to a table and laid the document down. He pointed to a paragraph at the bottom of the first page. "Let me read the terms for everyone so there is no confusion," Patterson said. "The tenant agrees to pay a yearly rent of $1. The tenant acknowledges that he has no equity interest in the property. The lease is at will and may be terminated by the landlord at any time with proper notice or immediately upon breach of contract." $1, Vanessa whispered. The fight was draining out of her. She looked at Brandon with horror. "You pay $1. Brandon flinched. "Dad set it up that way," he mumbled. "It was for tax purposes, Vanessa. He said it was smart." "It was smart for me," I interjected. "It protected my asset from people like you." Patterson flipped to the final page of the lease. "Clause 14, Section B," Patterson read aloud. "Conduct detrimental to landlord. The landlord reserves the right to terminate this lease immediately and without cure, period, if the tenant engages in conduct that threatens the safety, reputation, or legal standing of the landlord." He looked up. His eyes were hard behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "2 days ago, Mr. Brandon Caldwell left a voicemail for his father, threatening to file a fraudulent petition for guardianship. He threatened to use the police and the courts to strip Mr. Edward Caldwell of his legal rights based on false claims of dementia." The room gasped. This was not just a financial dispute anymore. This was a betrayal of the highest order. "That constitutes detrimental conduct," Patterson stated, closing the binder with a final snap. "It is a hostile act. It violates the spirit and the letter of the lease. Therefore, the lease is terminated, effective immediately." Vanessa looked at the sheriff. She looked for a lifeline. "But you cannot just kick us out," she stammered. "It is winter. We have rights. We have a child." Sheriff Miller stepped forward. His hand rested on his belt. He was not smiling. "Actually, ma'am, you do not have rights here anymore," he said, his voice deep and rumbling. "You are now classified as squatters. And since Mr. Caldwell has obtained an emergency writ of possession from a judge this afternoon, you are trespassing." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Brandon. Brandon took it with trembling hands. "This is the eviction order," the sheriff said. "It gives you 1 hour to gather essential personal items. Medicine, basic clothing, toiletries. Anything else stays. The furniture stays. The electronics stay. The artwork stays. If you try to remove assets belonging to the landlord, you will be arrested for theft." 1 hour, Vanessa shrieked. "But my clothes, my jewelry." "Your jewelry," I cut in. "The jewelry you bought with my credit card." "That is evidence, Vanessa. It stays." I looked around the room at the guests. They were paralyzed. They were watching the dissection of a social climbing fraud, and they could not look away. And there is one more thing, the sheriff added. He turned his gaze to Mr. Henderson and the other potential investors. My office has received credible reports that this address has been used to conduct wire fraud and unlicensed gambling operations. We have evidence that funds solicited for business investments were diverted to offshore betting accounts. Henderson's face went gray. He pulled the check from his pocket. He stared at it as if it were contaminated. Gambling, he whispered. You told me it was a tech startup, Brandon. You told me your father was the guarantor. I looked at Henderson. I am not the guarantor of anything I said. I am the victim. My son has been stealing from me for 5 years. He has been stealing from his own child's education fund. If you give him that money, you are not investing. You are throwing it into a fire. Henderson tore the check in half. The sound of the ripping paper was loud in the silent room. He tore it again and again until it was confetti. He threw the pieces on the floor at Brandon's feet. You are a liar, Henderson said, his voice shaking with anger. You stood there and lied to my face. Other guests began to move. The spell was broken. They were not just bystanders anymore. They were victims who had almost been scammed. They looked at Brandon with disgust. They looked at Vanessa with pity. I am leaving, Henderson announced. I am going home. And if you ever contact me again, Brandon, I will call the FBI. The exodus began. People grabbed their coats. They did not say goodbye. They did not thank the hosts. They fled. They wanted to wash the stink of failure off their clothes. Vanessa stood in the center of the emptying room. Her red dress looked like a wound. She looked at the sheriff. She looked at the lawyer. She looked at me. This is your fault, she hissed at me. You did this. You planned this. You humiliated us. I did not plan your greed, Vanessa, I said. I did not plan your adultery. I did not plan your neglect of my grandson. I just turned on the lights. If you do not like what you see, that is your problem. I checked my watch. You have 55 minutes left. I suggest you start packing. The sheriff will be supervising you to make sure you do not take anything that I paid for, which by my calculation is everything. Vanessa looked at Brandon. She waited for him to fight. She waited for him to be the man he pretended to be. But Brandon was broken. He was staring at the torn pieces of the check on the floor. He was staring at the ruin of his life. She made a sound of pure disgust. You are pathetic, she spat at her husband. You are useless. She turned and ran up the stairs, her heels clacking on the wood. Brandon did not move. He stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by half-eaten food and empty glasses. The party was over. The guests were gone, and the landlord was waiting. My son tried to tell the guests that I was confused. He tried to tell them that I was having an episode. He looked at Mr. Henderson, who was halfway out the door, and begged him to wait. He said I was making it all up. He looked at me with eyes that pleaded for me to play the villain so he could remain the victim. I walked to the buffet table. It was piled high with imported cheeses and seafood. I looked at the waste. I looked at the lies. With one sudden motion, I swept a silver tray of oysters onto the marble floor. The crash was deafening. It stopped everyone in their tracks. Henderson turned back. Vanessa froze on the bottom step of the staircase. Brandon flinched as if I had struck him. I am not confused, Brandon, I said. My voice was steady. It was the voice of a man reading a death sentence. I am the most lucid person in this room. I reached out to Detective Griffin. He handed me the thick manila envelope. I undid the string. I did not hand the photos to my son. I threw them. I threw them onto the white tablecloth amidst the wreckage of the feast. They fanned out like a deck of playing cards. Glossy high-definition prints that captured every lie in Technicolor. Look, I commanded. Look at your life. The first photos showed Vanessa. They showed her outside the Peninsula Hotel. They showed her kissing the personal trainer. They showed her hand on his chest. They showed them entering the elevator. The guests nearest the table gasped. They leaned in. They could not help themselves. Vanessa stood on the stairs. Her face went from pale to ghostly white. She saw herself. She saw her secret laid out next to the shrimp cocktail. I paid for the hotel, Vanessa, I said. My voice cut through the room. I paid for the champagne you drank with him. I paid for the watch you bought him. You told my son you were at a wellness retreat. You told me you needed money for your mental health. I pointed at the photos. That is your wellness. A 24-year-old model you bought with my retirement savings. Brandon stared at the photos. He picked one up. His hand shook so badly the paper vibrated. He looked at his wife. He looked at the photo. The betrayal was absolute. Vanessa, he whispered. You said you were at the spa. She did not answer. She could not answer. The evidence was irrefutable. I turned to Brandon. I reached into the envelope again. And you, I said. You want to talk about your tech startup. You want to talk about your investors. I threw the second stack of papers. They were bank statements, betting slips, screenshots of crypto losses. They covered the table in a blizzard of red ink. There is your Series B funding, Brandon. I pointed at a screenshot of an offshore betting site. $50,000 on a boxing match. Gone in 3 minutes. $20,000 on a horse race. Gone. $200,000 of seed money sent to a wallet in Malta. I looked at Henderson. He did not invest in technology, Mr. Henderson. He invested in high-stakes poker and Ethereum leverage. He lost it all. He lost the money I gave him. He lost the money you gave him. And the worst part is, he lost the money that belonged to his son. I pulled out the final document, the report card, the tuition theft. He stole his own son's tuition, I said. My voice dropped to a growl. He sent my grandson to a failing school so he could play roulette online. He let the boy eat dry cereal in the dark so he could wear a tuxedo and pretend to be a king. Brandon dropped the photo of Vanessa. He looked at the bank statements. He looked at the ruin of his lies. He fell to his knees. It was not a theatrical gesture. His legs simply stopped working. He collapsed under the weight of the truth. The room was silent. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the ragged breathing of my son. The guests were gone. The investors were gone. The only people left were the witnesses to this tragedy. I looked at them. I looked at the woman who had cheated on my son. I looked at the son who had cheated his own child. They were stripped bare. The clothes did not matter anymore. The house did not matter. They were empty. You asked why I came here tonight, I said. I looked down at Brandon. I did not come to ruin your party. I came to save my grandson. You broke the law, Brandon. You broke your marriage. But worst of all, you broke the sacred trust of being a father. I turned to the sheriff. Get them out of my house. I did not look back. I walked toward the library where I knew my grandson was hiding. I had a promise to keep, and unlike my son, I intended to keep it. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind the last fleeing guest. It was a sound of finality that echoed through the cavernous hall like a gavel striking a block. The investors were gone. The friends were gone. The illusion of power and prestige had vanished out the door into the snow, leaving behind only the wreckage of a fraudulent life. Henderson had been the last to leave. He hadn't even looked back. He just stepped over the spilled oysters and walked out, shaking his head as if waking from a bad dream. Now it was just us. The sheriff stood by the archway, his arms crossed, a silent sentinel of reality. Patterson was closing his binder, his job done. And in the center of the room, the two people who had conspired to bleed me dry were left alone with the consequences of their greed. Vanessa stood over Brandon. He was still on his knees, staring blankly at the gambling receipts that carpeted the floor. The silence stretched tight, a rubber band about to snap. Then she moved. It was not a movement of comfort. It was an explosion of violence. Vanessa swung her arm and slapped Brandon across the face. The sound was sharp and wet, a crack that made the sheriff flinch. Brandon's head snapped to the side, but he didn't make a sound. He didn't raise a hand to defend himself. He just took it. "You useless, pathetic liar," she screamed. Her voice was raw, scraping against her throat. "You told me you had it handled. You told me the old man was stupid. You told me we were rich." She hit him again, backhanded this time. "I wasted 5 years on you. 5 years pretending to respect you. 5 years pretending to believe in your delusions. And for what? To be thrown out on the street in a blizzard. To be humiliated in front of everyone I know." She spat on the floor next to him. It was a gesture of pure contempt. "I am done, Brandon. Do you hear me? I am done. I want a divorce. I am not going down with you. I am not going to be poor because you are incompetent." She turned her back on him. Her hands were shaking violently as she clawed for her phone in her clutch. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the sheriff. Her eyes were wild, focused on the glowing screen. She was looking for her life raft. She was looking for the exit strategy she had been nurturing on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I watched her dial. I knew exactly who she was calling. She was calling the 24-year-old model. She was calling the man she had bought with my retirement savings. She pressed the phone to her ear, her knuckles white. "Pick up," she hissed. "Pick up, Julian." She paced in a tight circle. Silence. She pulled the phone away, looked at the screen, and redialed. "Come on," she pleaded. "Just answer the phone." I stepped forward slightly. I watched the realization hit her in slow motion. "He is not going to answer, Vanessa," I said quietly. She spun around, glaring at me. "Shut up, old man. You don't know anything. He loves me." "He loved the credit card, Vanessa," I corrected her. "He loved the Rolex. He loved the hotel suites." She looked back at her phone. She opened her text messages. Her thumb flew across the screen, sending a desperate plea. Then she froze. Her face went from red to a ghostly pale gray. "It says not delivered," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "It says user not found." I nodded. "I canceled the card 3 hours ago, Vanessa. He probably tried to buy a drink or book a ride, and it was declined. He realized the money was gone. And people like him, Vanessa, people like you, they don't stick around when the check bounces. He blocked you." She stared at the phone as if it had turned into a snake. The truth sank in. There was no white knight coming. There was no lover waiting to whisk her away. She was not a pampered socialite with a side piece. She was a middle-aged woman with no job, no money, no husband, and now no lover. She had been discarded just as easily as she had planned to discard me. She let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She threw the phone. It skittered across the marble floor and cracked against the base of a pillar. She looked at Brandon huddled on the floor. She looked at me standing tall in my suit. She realized she was alone, completely and utterly alone. She didn't say another word. She turned and ran. She ran for the door, her heels clacking unevenly on the stone. She didn't grab a coat. She ran out into the freezing night in her red dress, chasing a future that had already disappeared. The door swung shut behind her, leaving a swirl of snow on the threshold. The alliance was broken. The parasites had turned on each other and scattered. Now there was only one left. The silence that followed Vanessa's departure was heavier than the blizzard outside. It settled over the ballroom like a suffocating blanket. Brandon was still on his knees amidst the ruin of his gala. He looked at the closed door where his wife had vanished. He looked at the pile of gambling receipts that proved his crimes. He looked at the sheriff who was unhooking a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Then he looked at me. For the first time in 5 years, he did not look at me with calculation. He did not look at me to see how much he could extract. He looked at me with the raw, terrified eyes of a child who has woken up in a room where the walls are closing in. The arrogance was gone. The swagger of the tech CEO was gone. All that was left was a 38-year-old man who had never learned how to tie his own shoes because I had always bought him loafers. He crawled. He did not stand up. He crawled across the cold marble floor, pushing aside the spilled oysters and the broken glass. He crawled until he reached my feet. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the fabric of my trousers. His grip was tight, desperate. He buried his face against my leg and began to sob. It was an ugly sound, a wet, gasping noise that echoed in the empty room. "Dad, please." His voice was muffled against my suit. "You cannot let them take me. You cannot let this happen. I am your son. I am your flesh and blood." He looked up. His face was a mess of tears and snot. His eyes were bloodshot. It was her dad. It was all Vanessa. She made me do it. She needed the money. She needed the lifestyle. I just wanted to make her happy. I just wanted to be the man she wanted. I did not mean to hurt anyone. I did not mean to hurt Timmy. I looked down at him. I saw the lie forming even as he spoke. He was still doing it. He was still trying to shift the blame. He was blaming the woman he had married. He was blaming the circumstances. He was blaming everyone but the man in the mirror. "I am broke, Dad." He squeezed my leg tighter. "I have nothing. The bookies are going to kill me. If I go to jail, I will die. You have millions. You have so much money. You can fix this with one check. Just write one check, Dad. Pay them off. I will go to rehab. I will get a job. I promise. Just do not let me drown." He was begging for his life. But he was not begging for forgiveness. He was begging for a bailout. He did not care about the pain he had caused. He cared about the consequences he was about to face. Think about Mom. He played his final card. The card he knew was the most painful. Mom would not want this. She would not want her baby boy in prison. She would want you to show mercy. We are family, Dad. Blood is thicker than water. You cannot throw your own blood out into the snow. I felt a phantom pain in my chest. He was right. Catherine would have been heartbroken. She would have cried. She would have wanted to save him. But Catherine never saw him steal his son's tuition. Catherine never saw him let a stranger raise his child while he gambled away our legacy. Catherine loved the boy. He was not the monster he had become. I looked at the top of his head. I remembered holding him when he was a baby. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike. I remembered the pride I felt when he graduated high school. Those memories were real. But the man clinging to my leg was a stranger. He was a parasite who had consumed the son I loved. He continued to weep loud, theatrical sobs meant to break a father's heart. He thought that because we shared DNA, I was obligated to be his victim forever. He thought that shared blood was a suicide pact. I stood still. I did not pull away yet. I let him cry. I let him beg. I let him expend the last of his dignity on the floor of the house he never owned. I needed to see this. I needed to see him hit rock bottom so I could be sure there was nothing left to save. I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my trousers. He was 38 years old, but in that moment he was 5 years old again, throwing a tantrum, because he couldn't have a second ice cream cone. The difference was that this tantrum had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and damaged a child's life. I reached down and firmly peeled his fingers from my leg. His grip was weak, sweaty. I took a step back, putting distance between us. The physical separation felt like cutting an umbilical cord that should have been severed decades ago. "Get up, Brandon," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through his sobbing. "Stand up!" He looked up at me, confused by the lack of comfort. He wiped his nose on the sleeve of his ruined tuxedo. He slowly got to his feet, swaying slightly. He looked small. He looked broken. "Dad," he whispered, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You'll help me?" I looked him in the eye. I didn't blink. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, absolute and final. "I am not going to help you, Brandon. I am done helping you. Because every time I helped you, I was hurting you. I was teaching you that actions don't have consequences. I was teaching you that you could set fires and someone else would always come with a bucket of water." I pointed to the pile of gambling receipts on the floor. "You did this. You made these choices. You chose to steal. You chose to lie. You chose to neglect your son." "But I'm your son, he cried, the entitlement flaring up one last time. "Yes," I said. "And that is why I have to do this. Because a father who lets his son become a monster is not a father. He is an enabler. I failed you, Brandon. I failed you by making your life too easy. I failed you by letting you think you were owed the world." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "I am not punishing you because I hate you. I am punishing you because it is the only way to save you. You need to hit the bottom, Brandon. You need to feel the concrete. You need to know what it feels like to have nothing but your own two hands to pull yourself up. That is how I built my life, and now it is time for you to start building yours." "But prison," he whimpered. "Prison is just a room," I said. "You've been in a prison of your own making for 5 years. At least in this one you won't be able to hurt anyone else." I turned to Sheriff Miller. I nodded once. "Sheriff, please remove the trespasser." The sheriff stepped forward. The handcuffs clicked. The sound was mechanical, cold, and necessary. Brandon didn't fight. He slumped, defeated. As they led him away, he looked back at me one last time. His eyes were empty. The arrogance was gone. The hope was gone. All that was left was fear, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. I watched them walk him out the front door, past the ice sculpture that was now just a puddle of water, past the grand staircase he had never paid for. The door closed. He was gone. I stood alone in the silence of the empty house. It was over. The cancer was cut out. The wound would bleed for a long time, but the healing could finally begin. I turned and walked toward the library. My grandson was waiting, and for the first time in his life, he was going to be the priority. 6 months have passed since the night the music stopped at 42 Oak Lane. The house was sold 3 weeks after the eviction. It did not go to a speculator or a developer. It went to a young family who saved for 10 years to put down a deposit. The millions I made from the sale did not go back into my bank account. Every single cent went into the Catherine Caldwell Scholarship Fund. It pays for the tuition of 50 underprivileged children in Chicago, children who have the hunger to learn that my son never had. It is the legacy Catherine would have wanted. As for Brandon, he is not in prison. Not yet, anyway. He took a plea deal, 5 years of probation and full restitution. He lives in a studio apartment above a garage in Cicero. I drove by his workplace yesterday. It is a greasy spoon diner on the edge of town. I watched from my car as he hauled bags of trash out to the dumpster. He was wearing a stained apron and rubber boots. He looked older. He looked exhausted. He looked real. He saw me watching him. He didn't wave. He didn't come over to beg. He just nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement of reality, and went back to scrubbing the grease off the pavement. It will take him the rest of his life to pay back what he stole, but for the first time in 38 years, he is earning his dignity 1 hour at a time. The sun is setting over Lake Geneva, casting a long golden reflection across the water. The air is crisp and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. I am sitting on the end of the dock in an old folding chair. Next to me sits Timmy. He looks different now. The hollows under his eyes are gone. He has gained 10 pounds. He laughs loud and often. He is currently attending a private academy near my penthouse, and last week he brought home a science project with a gold star on it. I reach into my pocket and pull out the object that started this entire journey, the antique pocket watch. I polished the brass until it shines like a mirror. Timmy, look here. I hand him the heavy metal disc. He takes it carefully, treating it with a reverence his father never possessed. He pops the latch and watches the intricate gears spin. Is this the one from the story, Grandpa? The one that went to war? It is, I say. And now it is yours. It reminds us that time is the most valuable thing we have. You cannot buy more of it, and you should never waste it on people who do not value you. He smiles at me. It is a genuine smile, one that reaches his eyes. It is his grandmother's smile. I feel a lump in my throat. I lost a son that night in the snow. It is a scar that will ache every Christmas for the rest of my life. But as I watch my grandson cast his fishing line into the water, strong and safe and loved, I know I made the right trade. I pruned the rot to save the roots. The Caldwell legacy is not the money or the buildings or the name on the trust fund. It is this boy sitting on the dock, and this time the foundation is solid rock. I learned that the most dangerous thing you can give a child is a life without consequences. For years, I thought my money was a shield for my family, but in Brandon's hands, it became a weapon that almost destroyed my grandson. True legacy isn't the numbers in a bank account or the name on a building. It's the values you instill in the next generation. Sometimes you have to let the people you love fall so they can finally learn how to stand up on their own. It was the hardest thing I ever did, but saving Timmy was worth every tear. If you agree that family is defined by loyalty and not just blood, hit the like button and subscribe to see more justice served.